Well, what a fantastic afternoon we've had so far, and I can't thank everyone enough, from the panellists to the delegates, for your brilliant contributions. But the action does not stop there. At 2:30, over in our breakout sessions, Harbo will be offering nutritional advice to help farmers make their businesses more sustainable and profitable in the challenging times ahead. But here on the main stage, Moredun are running an animal health workshop looking at sustainable parasite control, where they are keen to get across the message, test, don't guess. Now, it's a very special year for Moredun, who are celebrating their centenary. Founded by farmers to help address the needs of the farming industry, Moredun has continued to support farmers through its world-leading research into infectious diseases of farmed livestock for the past 100 years. I know I speak on behalf of the farming industry in thanking them for the fantastic work they do. And now may I introduce their chair, Duncan Millar.
Thanks, Claire, for that introduction, and welcome everybody this afternoon to our Moredun presentation and our contribution towards AgriScot 2020. I'm Duncan Millar. I am a farmer from Aberfeldy in Highland, Perthshire, and at the moment have the very great privilege of chairing the Moredun Foundation. To manage anything, or most situations, any situation, it is important for us to actually understand what we are trying to manage. In the world of agriculture, I think we are fairly used to relying on experience to get ourselves through. In the modern world, however, there are a number of tools, useful tools, available to us to add some precision to experience. In our world, the role that we have as farmers is not just to produce sheep and cattle for the annual sale. We are obviously an important part of the supply chain for our. More than that, I think we are increasingly being seen as an important part of the environment, being custodians of the countryside. At the top, a top and very visible priority for us and everybody else in the rural situation is the health and welfare of our farmed livestock. When we manage the health of our livestock by minimizing disease through vaccines and diagnostics and disease management processes that we've been using for generations, we actually achieve several outcomes which are very beneficial indeed. Obviously, we improve the health and welfare of our farmed livestock. And we also improve the efficiency of the biological process that is farming. We also reduce our carbon footprint, optimize our impact on the environment through less waste during our farming process. That all gives us the opportunity, considerable contribution to influence the modern climate change, and we are part of and not part of the problem. In addition, we also contribute very strongly to the other important issue of our time, and that is antimicrobial resistance. Importantly in all of that, we also increase the profitability and bottom line for our farm businesses. So it's a win-win, and it's one which we are pleased and proud to be part of. As Claire mentioned, 100 years ago, our Moredun founding fathers set out to improve the health and welfare of farmed animals through research and through education. 100 years on, the words and the science have changed, but what has not changed is our drive to produce vaccines, diagnostics tests, and disease instruments that are the key priorities in developing as we go forward. And this afternoon's seminar is going to concentrate on the last two of these, the diagnostics and the disease management. We in farming are all too familiar with the parasites of sheep. Three of our senior scientists are with us this afternoon to discuss how we can assist us and our livestock by managing three important parasites. The first presentation is from Dave Bartley, who will describe his work around the measurement of worm burdens in sheep. He will be followed by Philip Skuce, a renowned expert on liver fluke, and the third final paper will be delivered by Stuart Burgess, who has huge in the understanding. Sheep, you've heard all these presentations. There will be the opportunity for questions, so please take advantage of the facility on the questions in, and after the three presentations I will endeavour to direct your questions to the panel, and I'm sure we'll have an interesting discussion. So with that introduction, Dave, can I hand over to you for to give us the first paper? Dave Bartley.
Hiya, thanks Ian, and welcome everybody on this grey and dreich afternoon. As Ian says, I'm really going to focus on roundworms, my colleagues and myself have been involved in the production of this newsletter, which is freely available to all from the Moredun's website. So the talks are going to focus around the sort of content of that. As Ian has said, I'm going to focus on the roundworms, and liver fluke and sheep scab will follow on from that. So, okay, we have good products that work. So, does it really matter that we monitor and test and control in order to improve control? Yes, I think this is something we do. As you can see from this slide, on the left-hand side, we have a whole range of different parasites, and yes, each of the products works against these different parasites. But as you can see, they differ in their sort of pathogenicity, how much damage they actually do to your animals. But also, and on the other side of it is that they also have a different tendency and ability to sort of develop resistance. That doesn't mean that resistance doesn't evolve in all of the parasites. It does, but there are certain ones where resistance is more likely to occur. And the other part from this is that also what we're actually seeing is that we're seeing a difference in timings of when we would traditionally have seen these things. So we're starting to see things like nematodirus occurring in the autumn. We're starting to see homuncus occurring in areas that we haven't previously seen it. So all of these things really mean that we do have to get a good handle on it. And if we look at cattle, yeah, resistance is most commonly identified in the Cuperia species, but we're starting to see this in the more pathogenic Ostatigia as well. So we do need to get a better handle on what's going on. So yeah, I think actually Ian has done a cracking job of talking about the why do we want to monitor, why do we test, you know, what benefit is there from there, you know, and obviously the obvious ones are improved productivity and efficiency. We you know, off the back of talking about that these things are production limiting parasites in all of them, you know, and obviously the knock on from that is you see an improved health and welfare. We also are, you know, we can identify if problems are there early, and we can, and as Ian said, you know, that helps us on reducing waste, reducing the carbon footprint of our animals. And also by using these tools, we can actually develop a risk map of what is happening on farms, so we can identify areas where parasites or any sort of pathogen is a problem, or where it may not be, and where we might need to spend a bit more time and thought as to controlling these things. And finally, it's really looking at being able to maintain the effectiveness of treatments for both now and for the future. So, you know, we have products there, that, as I started with, but we just need to make sure that we still have these for the future. So we have a range of diagnostic tools. In sheep, we maybe have fewer options than we do in cattle. They tend to revolve around egg counts and sort of genotype type studies. Whereas in cattle, we have serological and milk-based tests where we can identify whether there are parasites there and whether or not they're causing damage. So I'm going to talk a bit about the sort of fecal egg counts, because albeit I've put it underneath the sheep one. It's equally as important for cattle as well. So fecal egg counts. So they are a workhorse or they certainly can be, but I think they're quite often underestimated as what they actually can do. So yeah, they can tell us whether or not nematodes are a problem or not, or whether there are other parasites out there, such as coccidia. They can often give us some indication of what the roundworm type is, so is it nematodirus, is it things like homuncus? Again, they can give us a steer as to what might be the problem. They also can sort of give us information on the timing and targeting of treatments. And yeah, obviously that is really important because it allows us to preserve the efficacy of our products. And finally, in the last one, we can identify efficacy and we can look to see how well products are working. Because obviously, if they're not working as we want them to, we're not getting the benefits from them. So yeah, how do we go about that? Well, there's two real main staples for this. There's the post-drench efficacy check, which is basically looking at animals post-treatment and seeing whether or not there's eggs present. Obviously, if there's eggs present, then it hasn't worked as efficient. The drug hasn't worked as efficiently or as effectively as we want to, and we probably want to investigate this more fully. Obviously, if we're only looking at counts at post-treatment, if they are 0 post-treatment, it doesn't mean that they had an egg count beforehand. They could have been 0 beforehand. So we have to bear that in mind if we're just looking at this. If we're looking at the full test, the fecal egg count reduction test, then we're looking at treatments, pre and post. So we know that they have eggs in their feces, and we know that the treatment has worked if we look at it. The timings are a little bit where they're about 7 to 14 days. So we know that those are the sort of timings that we want. And of course, we don't have to use individual counts. We can look at compositing. And again, you can sort of speak to your vet or fecal egg count provider to get more sort of information about this. So what is the take-home message from it? Unfortunately, there's the sort of monitoring and testing. There's no sort of hard and fast blueprint to it all because it varies from farm to farm and field to field. It varies at different times of year. But what we can take from it, the take-home message is that by using these monitoring tools, we can actually make a difference, and we can actually improve the productivity and health and welfare and all the other things that I spoke about earlier. Okay, it appears the last part of it is frozen, so I haven't got the last bit. But the last part of that, oh, there we are. Yeah, really just what I was saying there. It is the key to sort of effective control for any of the parasites, and my colleagues will talk about it too, is actually being able to understand the risks that worms pose on your farm, being able to build up that picture. And I think it gives you that ability to develop a clearer picture of what is there. Because obviously, if you're not able to test it, you aren't able to do something about it. So this is a good baseline in which you can benefit from it. And that it really is a take-home message. Any monitoring will help improve your lot. So thank you very much. That was my whistle stop for.
Thanks, Dave. Very, very interesting and useful contribution. I think as a sheep farmer, really listen to what you've got to say and find it extremely interesting. It's a whole new world for us that we've developed over the last year or two in terms of some of these monitoring programs. But thank you very much for trying to shed some light for us. It's some quite difficult messages there, and I've no doubt when we come round to the discussion time, that there will be questions to try and develop that a little bit further. The next presentation is on another parasite, which is of great interest, certainly in my part of the world, and I suspect further afield for many people in on this broadcast as well, and that's on liver fluke with Phil Skuce. And I think we've got some of the technicalities sorted out, and Phil's up and ready to go. So Phil, over to you.
Ian, thanks very much. Yeah, I can just about see my slide. Yeah, hello everybody, and thanks for tuning in. I'd just like to pick up where Dave left off and say a little bit about fighting fluke in sheep and cattle. Dave was talking about roundworms, but liver fluke is actually a flatworm parasite, the scientific name Fasciola hepatica, so much more interesting and complicated organisms than what Dave works on. Usually tease him about that. But it's got a complicated life cycle involving this tiny little mud snail you can see on the tip of my finger there. So they're really hard to find, but really important because they spread disease. They're a threat to sheep and cattle of all ages, and also wildlife. So deer and rabbits and hares can keep liver fluke going. And there's a significant environmental component to the life cycle because they spend so much of their time outside on pasture, on the ground, in the snails. So climatic conditions are important, as is grazing management as to who goes where and grazes when. The life cycle is really important, and it's not just an academic interest. I know I need to get out more, but it does inform a lot of what we do around diagnostics. So having a feel for that is really important. So if you start at the top there, we have the adult flukes in the sheep and cattle shedding eggs in the spring. Those eggs hatch and get into the snails in the summer. The snails shed the next stage in the autumn. Animals pick that up in the winter and start to show disease. But it's really important to have a feel for that. And no 2 years are the same, and no two farms are the same. We're lucky in the UK to have a fluke forecast. It's based on a formula developed back in the 1950s by a great old gentleman called Olrenshaw, and it's still named after him. There he is, top right-hand corner. And this is the most up-to-date version of it, the autumn forecast, which is run nowadays by NADIS, National Animal Disease Information Service, so well worth a look on their website. They'll tell you a little bit about the risk in your area. It's not very high resolution, but it's important to know kind of what's happening on the ground, and it's based on prevailing weather patterns. We've been talking about test, don't guess, so I guess we really should tell you what your testing options are. They fall nicely between invasive and non-invasive, if you like. We have invasive tests like post-mortem and meat abattoir inspection. You could argue that's too late, but it's pretty unequivocal. We've also got options around. I'm just checking the resolution on my slide there. There is actually a blood test available for fluke for sheep and cattle, and that's a really valuable test. The notes at the bottom just to indicate that that's become a really useful test for first season grazers because they can only be antibody positive in the blood test if they've experienced fluke this year. Older animals, it's less easy to interpret, but certainly for young animals, that's a really good test. In terms of the more non-invasive tests, there's clinical signs, so it helps to know what a fluky animal looks like. There's a bulk milk tank equivalent for the dairy guys, equivalent to the blood test. That's useful, but it's at a herd level rather than individuals. But as Dave said, the fecal egg count has really become the workhorse. It's a slightly different test for fluke, but it does essentially the same thing. But you have to bear in mind that it's only adult liver fluke that lay eggs, so that's important. They're 10 or 12 weeks old already. And there is another test called the coproantigen test, which looks for a secretion in feces, so the same sample. It's a little bit more sensitive than the egg count, and it's a really useful indicator of treatment outcomes, so that's very helpful as well. So both those tests can be used as monitoring tools, but also to test the efficacy of treatment, so that they're really valuable there. Just to move my slide forward a second, I just lost my clicker. Yeah, so when it comes to treatment, which is largely with respect what a lot of farmers do is try to treat the way out of trouble, and that's not that sustainable. There aren't that many products to choose from. There's really only 5 chemicals. And if we start at the bottom, the key message I'd like to get across from this slightly complicated table is that each of the drugs does something different. If there is a drug of choice, it would be triclopendazole at the bottom, because that can cover most ages of fluke in sheep and cattle, from 2 days of age in sheep, 2 weeks in cattle, right through to adult. But then you've products like closantel coming in at about 6-7 weeks, nitroxanil coming in maybe 7 or 8 weeks, and then you've albendazole and oxyclosanide, which really only kill adults. But you can see there is a favoured time of year to think about using these, but we would like you to use them based on evidence and the need for treatment. And just to give you a little example of that, we did a test, don't guess case study on Fluke in Argyll, a lovely part of the world over in the west, lovely and wet and mild, Fluke Central, if you like. And it was the source of the first triclobendazole resistance reports in the UK back in the 1980s. So what we wanted to do was to try and confirm the triclobendazole resistance status. We did routine composite egg counting on 10 farms up and down the peninsula to inform the timing of treatment. And as what always happens when you do a Fluke project is the summer's lovely and dry and there's no Fluke about. And 2018 was really hot and dry, so Fluke was low and late. We eventually got to do our fecal egg count and copper antigen reduction tests, but it wasn't until February. But the key thing was that was able to confirm resistance on all 10 farms, which is not good news, but it's important to know that. But another key message was that most farmers got through 2018-19 without needing to treat at all. But those that did treated 4 months too early with a product that didn't work. So there's some very important messages coming out of a very straightforward study. And just to leave you with some take-home messages, and I put up the little banner that we all got used to in the early days of COVID. But the idea would be to have a working knowledge of the Fluke life cycle on your farm and the ability to risk assess fields or your farm for Fluke, to understand what the diagnostic tests, what's available, but more importantly, what each of them tells you about Fluke infection. To know the liver Fluke status of your animals and your farm, so test, don't guess, and know which products work on your farm and which don't, and again, test, don't guess. So I think if the technology supports me, I'll leave it there and hand over to Ian again, who possibly pass the baton on to Stuart.
Great. Thank you very much. A lot of good stuff there again. 2 questions coming in, but I'll hold them for just now. And our third and final is moving to the outside of the animal, and ectoparasites and sheep scab. Sheep scab, of course, has been a long-standing problem across the whole of the sheep industry in the UK. We almost got there about 30 years ago, but since then the understanding and science has been improved largely by Stuart Burgess, and we're very lucky that this afternoon it's Stu that's with us. So Stuart, looking forward to hearing a little bit about the update on where you are with recognition and control of sheep scab.
Thanks very much, Ian. Yeah, always sheep scab saved till last. I take that as a compliment. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit today about how you could use the sheep scab blood test that Moredun have been developing as a tool for improving on-farm biosecurity. So let's just see if these work. That's great. For those of you who don't know, the sheep scab mite, or Psoroptes ovis, which is on the left-hand side there, causes sheep scab. It infests the skin of the animals, and it causes, in this picture in the middle here by Neil Sargison at the Dick Vet, you can see some of the classical signs of scab. So you've got wool being rubbed and pulled off in the bottom left corner there. Up towards the top, you can see an animal scratching away at a fence panel. And then what's really kind of key for scab is in the back centre there, to the left, sorry, you'll see this animal arching its back and also giving this lip smacking behaviour, and that's really characteristic of sheep scab. So it's one of the top 5 sheep diseases from both financial and welfare perspectives. It's endemic in the UK. As Ian said, we have got rid of it, or almost got rid of it previously, but we're really not in a great situation just now. So we're very keen to use the tools that we are developing to do something positive about scab. And one of the real markers for that is that the cost to industry is very severe, and ranges anywhere from between 78 to 200 million pounds per year. It is estimated that we have about 10 to 15% of sheep farms experience scab in any one year. And in Scotland, we're maybe a little bit further ahead in terms of control, because in Scotland it is actually a notifiable disease, unlike the rest of the UK. So I don't know, this video, that's good, that video is working. So that just shows some animals that are infested with scab. And again, you can see those classical signs that they're showing, the back arching, the lip smacking, and really just trying to alleviate that scratching that the mites cause, the irritation that the mites cause. But actually it can take many weeks and sometimes even months before those signs appear after an infestation. And that part of that is that the disease spreads very slowly initially, and before you get the clinical signs, you can have anywhere between 60 and 90% of the flock being infected. So it's not really ideal to rely purely on the appearance of clinical signs for diagnosing the disease. Because you were likely to miss those subclinicals, and that subclinical spread is really important, a really important factor in the control of scab. So trying to find the disease without the clinical signs can be quite challenging. And part of this is trying to find a lesion in a fully fleeced animal, like the one you see on this video. But also, if the lesions are small, it can be very, very difficult just to find, one or two very small lesions, and almost impossible in some cases. Skin scrapings are the gold standard in terms of diagnosing scab, but 30% of submissions for skin scrapings are deemed to be inadequate. And this is often they can be just wool plucks, which really aren't very, very good for diagnosing sheep scab. And also the sensitivity of that method can be very low, in fact, lower than 20%. So it's for these reasons that Moredun then decided to develop a blood test for sheep scab. So it has very high levels of sensitivity and specificity. It importantly can detect the disease within a couple of weeks of infestation. And that's crucial because it means it can pick it up before those clinical signs can appear. So we can identify those subclinical animals. We recommend you use it as a whole flock test or management group test, and that involves testing 12 animals in a flock of any size. And that gives you the best possible outcome then when using the test. And it's currently available through BioBest. So just to give you a couple of scenarios here. So the first scenario, is using that whole flock treatment approach. So you're testing 12 animals in a group. The way the test works is that it costs currently £6 per animal. So if you add in the test costs, plus your call-out costs and bleeding costs for the vet, you're probably looking at around £160 for the test cost. So if you compare that to an estimate of around £900 to £1,000 for treating a flock of 500 ewes, then if that result comes back negative, well, you've saved yourself more than £800, which is obviously a real benefit. If it comes back positive, you've added a small additional cost, but the important part here is that you know then that it's sheep scab, because the test is very specific for the sheep scab mite. So it means you can give the right treatment at the right time. And when would you use it? I mean, we would recommend using it instead of a routine prophylactic treatment, because we don't want to be pushing ourselves into a situation where we're worsening resistance, particularly to the MLs. So perhaps in the autumn, but also when you're bringing animals onto your property. So I just quickly highlight a study that we did a couple of years ago on the Isle of Mull. So this was using the diagnostic test in anger in the field. So this was funded by Moredun and the NFUS, and it was spread over 2 years. In the first year, we tested all of the available flocks that we could get, 12 animals per group. And what we found was very little or very low levels of scab, if no scab at all. In year 2, we took a slightly different approach. We tested the tups there. So we were using the tups as sentinels of disease, testing them pre and then post-tupping to see if they picked up any signs of scab whilst they were out in the field. And the benefit of this is that it allows us to use a reduced number of samples and therefore maybe more commercially pleasing. So what we saw was a very different pattern of responses. So more borderline and more positive tests. I'll just quickly highlight here. So this is the graph here. So this just shows year 1 versus year 2. So you can see here in year 1, we had very few positive tests, just a little cluster there, all of which were identified as not having any obvious signs of scab. But on the right there in year 2, you can see we had a very different pattern of responses. And in actual fact, what we did see was an outbreak of scab that was confirmed. We used the test to follow that up and then limit the spread of that. And then thankfully, no further outbreaks were picked up at that time. So what does that mean for Mull? Well, I think that what we can assume on Mull is that scab is probably present, but at very low levels. And the island status means that the risk is generally relatively low. But without blanket treatment, then complete eradication is not likely or not possible. And therefore, biosecurity is probably the most potent tool that we have, along with quarantine. So it's really important to maintain fencing, check for any gaps, or particularly in shared rubbing areas. Where you can, use double fencing, but at the very least over high-risk areas. Communicate with neighbours, particularly when it comes around treatments, to coordinate those treatments, to make sure that you don't get into this cycle of failed treatments and reinfestation. Select animals from known health sources wherever possible, and also treat or test all incoming stocks and quarantine them for a suitable period of time as well. And then, of course, any handling facilities, transporters, those are all high risks for transmitting the disease. So it's important to clean those. And then finally, this little video just highlights why biosecurity is so important. So the animals at the bottom right here are all naive, no sheep scab infestation at all. But the sheep that we've just brought in on the left here does have scab. And you'll see, obviously, the sheep are going to do what sheep do, so they flock together wonderfully. And within a few seconds here, you'll start to see that, the transmission of that disease becomes quite likely amongst these animals. In fact, within a 2-week period, all of those naive animals became infested with scab. So biosecurity, very important. Don't let them in there in the first place is the key. And thank you for your attention.
That's great, Stu. Thank you very much indeed. Interesting stuff there. I'm going to go straight to the questions, guys, because there's a number coming in. And the first one I want to pick up is from Graham Loftus. He says, Dave, do you see the biggest benefit to worm control in future coming from breeding genetics, from nutrition, or from anthelmintic usage?
I think all of them will play a part, and I think that's one of the things that I think we'd all agree is that we need to use the tools that we have to the greatest, be that genetics, nutrition, or anthelmintics. I think anthelmintics will always have a part to play. I think they're exceedingly efficient, which is one of the reasons that we would like to see them sort of their efficacy prolonged for as long as possible. But yeah, I think we can add grazing management and pasture management in there too. So I think there's a whole raft of things that we can use, and I actually think we should be using all to their fullest to prolong the best of all of those, really.
Great, Dave. Thank you. Good question there. Another one here is coming from Alexander. I think this probably will be direct. Changing climate, what is likely to be the concern in terms of parasite control? Phil, do you want to go first on this?
Yes, I could, because my obvious answer will be Fluke, because the predictions going forward are warmer, wetter. But having said that, it depends how things pan out for real. I mean, we might get milder winters and a bit more disease with Fluke and rumen fluke going through into the winter time. But on the other side of that, you could also get very hot, dry springs, as we saw. 2018 has been a run of those. So that can knock Fluke on the head and knock it down low. So it never really gets off the ground. So I think that's, again, just reinforcing that we need to be monitoring and managing things and looking at every year in isolation, and as it is what it is. We can't project too much or assume too much, so it's about test, don't guess. I'm going to probably step on others' toes here, but I mean, there are some other parasite risks that come with a changing climate, depending how the climate changes. And Haemonchus might be one. We've started to see that creep into the south of England. It's kind of hot, dry preferences, and it really flourishes when you get a wet spell after a dry spell, and that's the sort of thing I'd be a bit worried about. I mean, there is Haemonchus on the ground up and down the country. It's more of a clinical problem in the south of England, but that's not to say it couldn't come here. So that's one we need to watch, because it's very pathogenic. Yeah, all of these changes, it really depends what happens, and it'll affect the prevalence, the geographic spread, survival over the winter, all the things that parasites really rely on. I'm sure Dave and maybe Stuart to some extent can pick up on bits of that. If I've left you anything, Nematodirus would obviously be another one.
Yeah, I was going to add Nematodirus to it, because I think, yeah, we're already starting to see changing patterns with Nematodirus, where we're starting to see bigger issues in older animals at the end of the season. So yeah, I suspect all of the pathogens we've spoken about will be influenced by that. We know that because of changing climate, we're seeing longer grazing seasons. So anything, because all of our parasites are out in the environment, I think anything that extends the length of time that they're exposed to these things, they have that potential to do it. But it may not necessarily be negative, because as Phil said, what it might mean is that some of the patterns of diseases change so that they're prolonged instead of concertinaed into short periods of time. Things like Nematodirus, you may see that their hatching patterns actually extend, so you may see that the diseases become less of an issue. It may not that they inherently just become more difficult. And I guess the other thing to add to it is the sort of extreme weather events as to whether or not we see things moved around with flooding events and these sort of things, which we may find that things are moved from one place to another in these events. We don't really know what happens, but it's not unforeseeable to think that they could be.
Stu, any comments on the climate change affecting scab?
Yeah, it's probably less of a concern for scab, mostly because the parasite spends almost its entire life cycle on the animal, so they're much less susceptible to either benefits or harms from climate change.
I've got a question here, which is from I would describe as a nameless cynic. Anger, and if so, where and how?
Repeat that, sorry, Ian.
Right.
Do you use for sheep scab in anger? If so, where and how?
Yes. More a reference to trying to test out the diagnostic as a tool in terms of, so on Mull particularly, this a small regional study. I should add that we have done quite a number of these studies now, so we have looked at the similar control using the diagnostic test in Northumberland, in the Pentland Hills, and also in the Angus Glens previously. And also DEFRA are proposing a future testing-based control programme for England as well.
Okay, thanks, Stu. One here, I think this was probably aimed at you, Phil. It's about Fluke. There's another one from Graham Loftus, actually. Is the control of the environment not the best way for farmers to control?
Oops. Again, frozen a wee bit there, but I got the gist of that. I think I got the gist of that. Yeah, thanks, Graham.
Okay.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, Fluke is such an environmental pathogen, more so than even worms, sorry, Dave, because it has its hosts, the snails and the wildlife that keep it going, even without livestock. Yeah, I think it needs to be treated in the round, as Dave said. It's an environmental problem, and I think we need an integrated approach to that. There are some environmental things that would appear to be good ideas, like drainage would be one. But we always have to bear in mind that there's a lobby and maybe a drive towards wetland and either introducing or retaining wetlands, which become or can become potential fluke habitats if they're grazed. Fencing is another option, the idea being to keep animals away from fluky parts of a farm at fluky times of the year, sort of in the autumn. But again, there may be a tension there with conservation grazing, where you actually want animals to get in close to wetlands and graze them down hard, for whether it's for invertebrates, for feed for wetland birds, or whether it's natterjack toads or whatever it happens to be. So there are some agri-environment considerations in all of this. So it's just trying to weigh up the pros and the cons and identify the win-wins. And I think it's all of the above. It's trying to reduce the burden, take the pressure off, so you don't need to treat as often. It's all of those things, and monitoring is a big part of that. And I mean, there's fair research effort to try and monitor the environment better. We're not very good at telling what a fluky field looks like or where the real infection is. It kind of comes too late when your animals present with fluke. So it's joining up all of those things, diagnosing parasite in the animals, but in the environment, and understanding the risk and being able to risk assess. So I hope that answers your question, but there are some tensions around environmental management.
We've just been asked to, as you can see. Are you there, Ian? Right. Okay. I think what we're doing. There are questions coming through on the thing, and so I know we've all got access to it, but I might as well, as you were chatting then, Phil, we might as well continue with that. There's a question from David Mitchell. With Trodax unavailable and triclobenzazole resistance, what is best for housed cattle, bearing in mind the damage is done before the adult stage?
Yes, there were some problems with availability of Trodax. I've heard that that's improved. That situation has improved slightly, but it is one of the very useful drugs at housing. There's a school of thought that thinks we shouldn't use triclobenzazole in cattle because they don't show clinical signs with acute fluke, which is really what triclobenzazole is for, and maybe retain it for sheep. But that's maybe a debate for another day. So closantel and nitroxanil, the active ingredient in Trodax, very much used around housing. And yeah, I'd still say closantel is a very useful product, and you could alternate the two. There are different ways you can do this. You can treat animals on the day they come into housing, but assuming that they've picked up an infection on the day, and then 6 weeks later with either the same product again, or preferably the other product. So you can alternate between Trodax or nitroxanil and closantel. So you're not just blanket treating with closantel, because that's the worry. People get wind of triclobenzazole resistance, usually without any confirmation, and then start getting stuck into closantel. So it would be the same story about judicious use and trying to alternate and rotate products where you can, but bear in mind what animals are bringing in to housing with them, and what stage they might be at. So there's no point necessarily in treating an animal that has been treated, say, 6 weeks earlier, and then it isn't carrying anything into housing. It's about dealing with what they're actually, thinking about what they're actually likely to be bringing in with them, and what's the right product to use to treat that. So a wee bit of thought required there. It's not just they're housed, I'll treat them. There's a wee bit of thought required as usual.
Oh, cool. Right, we've got a couple more. I think we've got a few more minutes. So there's one here from Emily Grant that says, there seems to be some indication, and I know this is a topic of conversation, Phil, that we've had, that dung beetles can help reduce pasture contamination. Are we missing something as a potential tool in our armory, and may we actually be actually damaging these by reaching for the drench gun? I
think that's a really interesting one, Dave, and thanks, Emily. It's quite a hot topic. There's been a fair bit of discussion around that. There's some really interesting evidence or information suggesting that dung beetles can actually remove larval stages of nematodes from dung pats before they really get onto pasture and get picked up by livestock. So that's really interesting. I'd be the first to say I need to get up to speed with that, and maybe there's some research needs done on that in this country. I'm not so sure about fluke, whether they can take fluke eggs out of fecal samples and reduce the fluke burden in the same way. There's always the issue with the snails and amplifying it anyway. So I think that might be one to watch. But yes, some of the chemicals, with regret, they're very active anti-invertebrate chemicals. That's why they do what they do. And there can be residues coming through in the feces, and that's something we need to watch and be aware of. This we can kill dung beetles, and dung beetles have lots of really useful ecological and other invertebrates, lots of ecological uses in taking dung pats into the ground and disseminating them and breaking them down. So it's all part of that discussion around the whole environmental impact in the animal, the residues in the animal, the residues on the ground, and understanding what the different drugs do. And again, trying to reduce treatments as much as we can, use them as little as we can, but as much as necessary. So it's, again, judicious use, sustainable practices, so that we have drugs if we need them down the line, but we don't just blanket treat everything and have environmental issues as well. So I think it's all of the above, and it's watch this space. I think Dave might have something to say too, but I think it's a really interesting one. But it just frames our parasites are just part of an ecological approach. They're part of the ecology, they're part of the environment, and we need to manage it as an integrated parasite control, sustainable approach going forward, and not just treat our way out of trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with everything you said, Phil. You know, I think it's one of these things. It's a really interesting area. That is true, actually. You know, it's getting late in the day. You know, but no, I think it is something that would be really interesting, because actually, if it does work and things, then, you know, as we've just said, you know, it is another of these things that we can add to our repertoire, and you know, so that would be. Anything we can do to improve that has got to be good. I think we've got time for one last question. And yeah, sorry, Stu, this one's for Phil again, so apologies. So it's about drainage and talking about draining lots of wet ground over the last 10 years. Will it impact, you know, will it impact on Fluke? Will it on Fluke numbers by draining big grounds, and does liming work?
Yeah, in theory, drainage should reduce the fluke burden because it just makes the ground pretty hostile for the snails. They are mud snails by definition, and they need they do what it says on the tin. They need mud, and it can be very small habitats. I mean, it doesn't have to be big, wet, boggy areas. It can be quite small, you know, wheel tracks and leaky water troughs, that sort of thing that's slightly poached. It's a really nice analogy that the snail habitat is kind of a Goldilocks thing. They don't like too much traffic. They don't like too acid. They don't like too alkali. They don't like too wet. They don't like too dry. So they like it sort of just right. So we have to kind of bear that in mind. But drainage certainly makes the habitat more hostile. It also dries up their food source, which is algae that grow on mud films. So that's all part of that. But again, I come back to the issue around the agri-environment side of that, and whether that's encouraged or not. The liming's a really interesting one, because that obviously can bring the pasture pH back up and improve grass growth and all the rest of it. That in itself, I mean, the snails actually like lime for their shells, so that they're quite happy there. And if it brings the pH up more towards neutral, you could argue that that's probably making the habitat a little bit more snail friendly, because they like sort of neutral pH, or slightly on the acid side of neutral. So, you know, if the pasture was, say, pH 4 or 5, which I've seen some have been, that's not so snail friendly. So you just have to bear in mind that you might be just tipping the balance a wee bit. But I think the most important part of that is that the sort of pH says a lot about the underlying geology and what you need to do to, you know, typically acid soils would tend to be peaty and waterlogged. Not all that snail friendly, but on the other side of that, alkaline soils tend to be quite chalky and dry, which doesn't suit the snails very much either. So it's just about understanding the snails a bit better. Old Dollar and Shaw really did, and maybe we need to get up to speed with that. So applying lime, no real evidence one way or the other, but you just have to bear in mind there could be a risk of making things slightly more snail friendly. Drainage should go the other way. Hope that helps. It's always complicated, isn't it?
There was one other question there that I just saw come in, which is around the possibility of pen-side testing. So at the moment, you know, particularly for the scab test, we're talking about a lab-based test, but we are looking to translate that into a pen-side sort of point-of-care test that would give you a result within, say, 5 or 10 minutes. And I think that, yeah, that kind of power to diagnose and then to inform treatment very rapidly is really going to be important in the future. So yeah, we obviously watch this space for that. The other aspect that we haven't touched upon is the development of vaccines, and that's a real kind of strength at Moredun. Obviously, we built a lot of our reputation on developing some very important vaccines over the years, and we certainly haven't stopped there. So we're continuing to produce different vaccines, and particularly vaccines against these parasites, which are inevitably much more tricky to produce than some of the earlier ones because of the complicated life cycles and the complexity of these parasites. So that takes a little bit longer, but I think we're making quite dramatic strides there. So again, another really important sort of space to watch for the future. But overall, I'd just like to obviously say thank you all very much for tuning in today. It's been a real pleasure for us to be able to tell you about our research and the developments we've had. As Ian mentioned at the beginning, this is a really important period for Moredun because this is our centenary year. And although it has been somewhat disrupted by the sort of COVID restrictions and lockdowns, and we haven't been able to get out as much as we would have obviously liked to, events like this have been really important for us to come and explain what we're doing and hopefully to get those key messages out there. And obviously the key message here is to test and don't guess. And if you do want more information on that, then again, as Ian said, go to the Moredun website. The Test Don't Guess booklet is available for a free download there. And again, also, if you have any other questions about that, then don't hesitate to contact any of us at Moredun, and we'll do our utmost to answer any of those additional questions.